April 4th, 1968. The United States of America. The country had been simmering to a boil for years. An assassinated president, a globally derided and domestically challenged war, a civil rights movement that had only grew in voice and stature by the year. America was reaching a boiling point. Yet on this day, the schools closed, the businesses were shut, and the nation and the globe were swept in outrage, shock, and mourning. Martin Luther King Jr. was dead. Martin Luther King stands as one of the most important and respected figures of the entire 20th century. His doctrine of nonviolence and searingly powerful public speaking brought a civil rights movement able to confront America's original sin like never before. In 1964, Dr. King would be given the Nobel Peace Prize for his remarkable impact on challenging racial inequality, and legislation would follow from the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act of 1964, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. However, King was fighting a cause in a country built on white supremacy, and challenging the moral authority of this put his life in danger. His life would be extinguished far too soon, but the immediate impact of the loss was profound and would be felt around the globe. A true American who upheld the best of the country's sense of possibilities by challenging it to be even better than it was. King's place in history is eternally assured. Yet, what were those moments after his loss like? Today, we follow the events immediately after the passing of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Before his assassination, the fate of Martin Luther King was closing in on him. King was no stranger to the precariousness of his position as a civil rights leader in the U.S. In 1958, he had survived an assassination attempt by an unhinged individual with a letter opener, no less. Yet, it was from the vocalization of his opposition to the Vietnam War that threats on King's life and overt attention from the authorities rose to new levels. A speech delivered in 1967, called Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, would mark King's arrival in the discourse, and it would prove costly. His decision to voice his long-held opposition to the war would cost him allies, including union leaders, publishers, and even President Lyndon Johnson. King was quick to see the double standard. The press lauded his nonviolent stance in America, but lambasted his reproaching of otherwise in foreign policy. Despite the cost to his standing in public life, already besieged by vulnerability, King would continue to speak for the anti-war movement and even call for a march on Washington the day after Lyndon Johnson's State of the Union address in 1968. Just months later, on April 3, 1968, Martin Luther King would fly to Memphis to speak at a rally at the Mason Temple Pentecostal Church. The circumstances would not be more emblematic of the importance of King's work and the danger it put his own life in. His flight to Memphis was delayed due to a bomb threat on his plane. Before even leaving for Memphis, King told his family that a contract had been put on his life. Despite a thunderstorm raging and King himself feeling ill, initially sending an associate to speak on his behalf, he went on to deliver his mountaintop speech. Only second to the I Have a Dream speech, King spoke for 40 minutes of improvisation that mixed biblical references and social conditions, referenced biography and prophecy, and simply brought the house down. A masterpiece of public speaking in a canon of many. It would be the last speech of Martin Luther King's life. On Thursday, April 4, 1968, a day after his final speech, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel where King and his associates would usually stay, James Earl Ray fatally shot King at 6:01 p.m. Efforts were instantly made to save King's life, and he was rushed to nearby St. Joseph's Hospital. The gunshot had been severe, and the odds to save Dr. King's life were slim. Medical personnel would perform emergency chest surgery, but they were not successful. King was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. His autopsy would reveal a man beset by the burden of his role. At 39 years old, Dr. King had the cardiac health of a 60-year-old. His 13 years of civil rights leadership had taken an enormous toll. America and civil rights globally had lost a titan, and the world would not be the same. An announcement to shake the world. 5 years after the assassination of JFK and 3 years following the assassination of Malcolm X, America was once again in a state of shock at devastating news. The presidential campaign was halted, the Academy Awards postponed, schools and businesses were closed. President Johnson declared April 7th a day of national mourning. Martin Luther King's death was, for many, a frightening extinguishing of the brightest candle, someone who spoke and stood for solidarity and Gandhian nonviolence in the face of a world serving up the opposite. Many across the civil rights community felt that King's death was a clear signal that nonviolence against white supremacy could not work. Across the deluge of shock and grief, Black Americans were angered, pained, and devastated. Many white Americans would also be saddened and shocked by the assassination, though this isn't to ignore the deification Dr. King has received in the decades since. Many would be unmoved by the murder and felt Dr. King's stances were only troublemaking. Needless to say, thousands took to the streets in protest and mourning, and the loss would be felt around the globe. In London, the House of Commons would soon pass the Race Relations Act for the United Kingdom, partly in outrage at Dr. King's death. British people in their thousands would gather at St. Paul's Cathedral, where King gave a speech in 1964. The Pope would pay tribute to Dr. King in his Palm Sunday Mass at St. Peter's Basilica. In Nairobi, Kenya, King's final speech would be read at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. The globe was truly shaken by the loss of a beautiful speaker and indelible figure of unity. Yet the pain caused by this loss in a federal United States was most felt by the domestic population. During a campaign stop, Robert F. Kennedy was able to speak with such earnest empathy. It quelled rioting there. Similarly, in New York City, Black residents in Harlem were spoken to directly by Mayor John Lindsay, which in the majority lessened rioting and looting. Yet in the month that followed, over 100 cities descended into chaos. Loss, anger, and the unfolding catharsis. From April 4th to May 27, 1968, the pain and disillusionment that King's slaying brought boiled over into mass rioting. The inner cities predominantly populated by Black Americans were hotbeds of arson, looting, rioting, and violence. In total, across over 100 cities, around 27,000 people ended up arrested. The figure injured sits around 3,500, and over 40 lost their lives. In Washington, D.C., some 6,100 people faced arrest, and over 1,000 were injured in the outpouring. On April 5th, rioters reached within 2 blocks of the White House before retreating. It's understood a 20,000-strong crowd entirely overwhelmed a D.C. police force of just 3,100. The total damages to Washington, D.C. was $27 million, and it would take Army soldiers with mounted machine guns before the city was considered safe on Sunday, April 8th. Chicago would experience mass arson seldom seen before or after, with over 120 fires resulting in 11 deaths. Over 200 buildings would be damaged by the time the city was brought to order on April 7th. Yet the fires were considerable and enormous. Even off-duty firefighters were requested for assistance. King's legacy would show its reach in Chicago and across other prevailing pockets of peace. The south side of Chicago was left mainly untouched and out of the chaos thanks to the presence of the East Side Disciples and the Blackstone Rangers. Dr. King had worked with these groups in 1966. They did not participate in the rioting, and they kept their neighborhoods under control. Alongside this, RFK's intervention, speaking for the first time about the passing of his brother in Indianapolis, kept rioting at bay. Yet it is Atlanta that remains a remarkable example of King's legacy being honored. The students and faculty members of its several historically Black colleges were able to keep the peace and even conduct a peaceful march in honor of King's nonviolence doctrine. Yet violence and arson were the prevailing reality across the country, and it would take citywide curfew and the deployment of the National Guard in many instances. In Louisville, Kentucky, 700 National Guard troops were deployed by the mayor. Wilmington, Delaware's mayor would request the same. These National Guard troops would not leave till January the next year, thanks to domestic political machinations. Detroit would also deploy the National Guard under Governor George Romney, father of Mitt. Baltimore, Chicago, and D.C., however, would take not only National Guard deployment, but military infantry beyond this. Ray for retribution. As for the man who took King's life, James Earl Ray fled the moment he'd taken the shot. Police at the crime scene were able to find from witness accounts a Remington rifle at a nearby boarding house. Ray drove away in a white Mustang to Atlanta before dumping the car and taking a bus to Detroit. From Detroit, Ray crossed the border into Canada, where he acquired a Canadian passport under the pseudonym George Sneyd. Befitting a man of his actions, Ray was hoping to make his way to the once Rhodesia, a white supremacist nation at the time, where extradition back to the U.S. would not be possible. Once he obtained his Canadian passport, Ray flew to London on May 6th. He changed his return flight to Canada and took a flight to Lisbon the following day. Ray planned to get on a boat bound for Africa and make it to Rhodesia. Yet fate would turn on Ray. He missed his boat, literally, and returned to London on the 17th of May. After 2 months spent on the run, As the most wanted man in American history since John Wilkes Booth, the authorities at Heathrow Airport captured Ray on the 8th of June. James Earl Ray would be extradited to Memphis on July 19th as somehow attempted to fight any kind of case. He fired his first lawyer, presumably for informing him, but his second lawyer would. He had no case, and there was no chance. He would face the full weight of the law. Pleading guilty on March 10, 1969, James Earl Ray was sentenced to 99 years at Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Tennessee. Ray would later rescind his confession, but it did not matter. He would escape once in 1977, but would be returned 3 days later. Ray would die in 1998 at a maximum security prison in Nashville. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.